Today's lesson is going to be on the ovarian cycle. This is a series of events that occurs inside the ovary, ranging from the development of an oocyte to ovulation, and then what happens as a result after that. These are the key words associated with today's lesson. Some of these will be familiar to you as we discussed them when we talked about oogenesis. The learning intentions associated with today's lesson are listed here. We are going to be focusing on the hormones associated with the ovarian cycle and how they interplay with the processes such as menstruation. So just to give you a bit of a recap, the ovarian cycle is a series of events that occurs within the ovary. Okay, so the ovarian cycle is what happens inside each ovary, whereas the menstrual cycle are the series of changes that take place in the lining of the uterus, which is the endometrium. And this only happens in non-pregnant females. Now, the average cycle is about 28 days, but we know that for some women it can be shorter or longer, so it really does depend on the individual, but that's why we say this is the average. Now, these two cycles, the menstrual cycle and the ovarian cycle, are controlled by hormones. Now, the hormones that we need to look at are the pituitary gland hormones, which are LH and FSH, and the ovarian hormones, which are progesterone and estrogen. So, we know that the endocrine system contains endocrine glands, which are ductless glands. Now, endocrine glands are these glands shown in the diagrams represented on males and females. Hormones are chemical messengers that travel in the bloodstream from the endocrine gland, and they will travel in the bloodstream until they reach their target organ or cell, where they'll diffuse and enact a response there. So, for example, hormones produced in the pituitary gland will travel down to the ovaries, where they'll enact a response on that tissue. So the endocrine glands, like we just said, are glands that secrete hormones directly into adjacent tissues, so hormones don't act on the gland that creates them, and we can see that in this little cartoon here. Now, hormones are chemicals which are secreted by endocrine glands. Again, just to reiterate, they are travelled in the bloodstream and then they will act on a target organ or cell. So at this point, I'd like you to pause the video and complete the table on page 12 of your booklet. Please ensure that you use pages 285 to 286 to help you complete that task. If you are working with a partner on this, you could perhaps swap and look at the male and female sides and then swap answers. On the next slide, we will go through those answers, so pause the video here while you complete that work. Okay, so these are the answers that we're going to be looking at. So we'll start with the first hormone. So this is follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH for short. This is secreted by the pituitary gland in both males and females. Now, follicle stimulating hormone will target the seminiferous tubules in the testes of men, and the effect is it stimulates the seminiferous tubules to start making sperm. In females, follicle stimulating hormone will target the follicular cells in the ovary, and it will encourage those cells to mature. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, again comes from the pituitary gland, and its target in men are the interstitial cells. So these are the cells found in between the seminiferous tubules, and it promotes the secretion of testosterone from the interstitial cells. In females, LH targets the ovarian tissue again, and it is directly responsible for ovulation. Looking down the list at estrogen, progesterone, HCG, prolactin, oxytocin and testosterone, please make sure that you use this table as a guide to mark your work. If there's anything that you missed, please make sure that you pause the video here and supplement your answers. Alright, so now we're going to start looking at the ovarian cycle. Now in this diagram we're just looking at what occurs. We can see here that before birth, so while you are still in the womb, if you're a female, we have the oogonium, which is the gamete mother cell here, and it undergoes mitosis. Okay, so at mitosis it produces more oogonia. And this occurs during the fetal phase of development. These oogonia will start to divide and grow and then enter meiosis 1. And you can see here that the primary oocyte that we talked about in the ovarian cycle is found in the oogenesis is found at the start of the ovarian cycle. So the primary oocyte is contained within a primary follicle. And it's known as a primary follicle because it has just one simple layer of follicular cells surrounding that oocyte. We know from oogenesis that meiosis 1 occurs but is arrested at prophase 1. So you can see here that the follicle will continue to develop and form a secondary follicle, and you can see that a secondary oocyte is within that secondary follicle. You should be able to note here that this follicle that contains the oocyte is getting bigger, but the egg stays the same size. Now we know that polar bodies are formed as a mechanism for reducing the number of chromosomes, and so at the end our ovum has just the haploid number of chromosomes present, and they are genetically different. So we're going to discuss all of this process in the ovarian cycle. So before we move on anymore, we're just going to review some terminology. So first of all, the oogonium are the gamete mother cells found here. The primary oocyte is a diploid cell, and it's found within the ovary that is about to undergo meiosis to produce haploid secondary oocytes. The secondary oocyte again is a haploid cell that undergoes meiosis to produce ova. And finally, the polar bodies are also haploid cells produced during oogenesis, but they contain very little cytoplasm, but half that nuclear material. So, to give us an overview before we start looking at the detail, the ovarian cycle is a cycle that occurs when you start puberty and will continue right through until menopause. The cycle, as we said, takes about 28 days on average and can be split into 2 phases. The first phase is known as the follicular phase, and the second phase is the luteal phase. Now, the ovarian cycle will only occur in non-pregnant females, which we will discuss and explain later. So the point of the ovarian cycle is to produce mature eggs. Okay, so we know that at birth humans have about 600,000 immature ova in each ovary. Now, as we go through birth and development, the primary oocytes are formed, but they are arrested in meiosis 1 at prophase, and they will not continue their development until puberty. So therefore, here at the start of that ovarian cycle, we have something called a primordial follicle that develops into a primary follicle. Now, when we think about the maximum number of eggs that a female will have, that is actually produced when the female is 20 weeks old as a fetus, not a baby, but as a fetus. So the number of eggs will reduce until you have about 600,000, and that will then drop to about 400,000 that will go through this development phase. Here we've just got an electron micrograph image just showing that ovarian tissue, and you can see these primary oocytes within the primary follicle. Here you can see a closer up image. You can just see there's just, 2 layers of cells around about this oocyte. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at the follicular phase, remembering that is the first part of the ovarian cycle. So at puberty, some of the primary follicles will undergo further development. And so what happens is those cells will start to enlarge and divide, and crucially those follicular cells will secrete fluid. And this is what makes that follicle appear bigger. So our oogonia will undergo mitosis and then partial meiosis. The follicles will start to grow in number surrounding the oocyte, and as the number of follicles grow in number, they start to secrete follicular fluid. So the secondary oocyte that you see here will contain the secondary oocyte. So the secondary follicle, will contain the secondary oocyte, and there will also be some fluid in that space. Now in this electron diagram here again, you can see that this cavity is that follicular fluid. These are the numerous layers of cells around the outside, and this is our secondary follicle. Now I want you to note here that it's being pushed to the outer wall of the follicle, whereas these immature follicles up here, they're kind of centered. Again, just another image to show you the same thing. So you should be able to recognize oocyte, follicular cells, and follicular fluid. Now, as more fluid accumulates within the secondary follicle, it will enlarge and it will push that secondary oocyte towards the edge of the ovary. And once this is into this state, we have a mature follicle. And you can see that here. So again, lots of follicular fluid, our oocyte is being pushed to the outer wall. Now at this point, the mature follicle will burst and that secondary oocyte will be expelled from the ovary and it will start to travel down the oviduct, and that is ovulation. It's really important to understand that this occurs roughly at about day 14, so halfway through the cycle. And the fimbriae of the oviduct will guide that expelled or ovulated egg down the oviduct ready for fertilization. Now again, we should note that because this is a sphere without any tail to propel it forward, within the oviduct itself there are cilia which beat in a rhythmical fashion that move that egg further down the reproductive tract. Now this diagram here is showing a cat ovary. So this is the ovarian tissue here, and it's showing the follicle quite pronounced and the point at which the ova is expelled in ovulation. Now that was the follicular phase. Now in the second half of the cycle, so we're talking days 15 to 28, we call this the luteal phase. So after ovulation, that ruptured follicle will collapse in on itself and form a clot. And you can see that at number 6 here. Now the remaining follicle absorbs this clot and it becomes enlarged and kind of yellow or creamy in colour and is now known as the corpus luteum. Now what's really significant about the corpus luteum is that it secretes really high concentrations of estrogen and progesterone. Now that is going to be significant later. It's actually important for the endometrial development. So here we can see the clot surrounded by the corpus luteum. So remembering that the ovarian cycle only occurs if fertilization does not take place, so let's assume that fertilization has not happened. At about 8 to 10 days after ovulation, so about day 22-24, there isn't anything to support the corpus luteum maintaining its structure, and it starts to degenerate into this other structure called the corpus albicans, and that's because it's whiter in colour. Now once the corpus albicans starts to form, it will start to degenerate and a new cycle will begin. If fertilization does occur, then the corpus luteum does not degenerate, it does not form corpus albicans, and therefore a new cycle is prevented from occurring. Now this will keep going on for the full first trimester or the first 3 months of pregnancy, and then the corpus luteum will eventually degenerate slowly, and it may still be present at childbirth but not necessarily. Okay, and you can see here that's the corpus luteum, just another diagram to illustrate what this tissue actually looks like. Okay, so here's a little summary showing that process of the ovarian cycle. So we start off with the primordial follicles, which will then mature and grow into the primary follicle. We can see that layer of follicular cells round about the outside. That primary follicle will continue to develop and mature, and we start to see this follicular fluid filling the cavity space. That mature secondary follicle, sometimes known as a Graafian follicle, will start to push its way to the edge of the ovary wall, and eventually it will rupture, releasing the egg. A clot will form, and we will have the formation of the corpus luteum, which is formed from that clot and the ruptured follicle. The corpus luteum, if it's not maintained due to pregnancy, it will start to break down into the corpus albicans, and the cycle continues on again. This is a really useful video to watch, outlining everything that we've talked about. I would recommend that you watch it to help you understand this process. So the summary so far. The ovarian cycle and oogenesis are linked, and they occur simultaneously. Oogenesis starts before birth but recommences at puberty. However, the ovarian cycle only starts at puberty. We know that the ovarian cycle is split into 2 phases. The first is the first 14 days, which is known as the follicular phase. And this is where the primary oocyte matures into a secondary oocyte, and the follicular cells around the oocytes start to grow, hence why we have a primary follicle and a secondary follicle. And then we have the continued production of follicular fluid, which is secreted into the follicle space. At round about day 14, ovulation occurs and an egg is expelled from the ovary. And then on the second half of the cycle, we have the luteal phase, and this is days 15 to 28. The egg, which is now in the oviduct, may or may not be fertilized, and if no fertilization occurs, menstruation will start to happen round about day 14, which leads to shedding of the endometrial lining, the egg, and some blood. If fertilization does occur, then the egg will complete meiosis. It will then become a zygote, and that will lead to pregnancy. Okay, so that's the end of this first part of the lesson. Please make sure that you have or will read pages 285 to 287 of your booklet, and I'd like you to complete pages 12 and 13 to consolidate your knowledge.